Hi, this is Jim of Shiloh Kahal, and I want to spend a little time sharing what I have been learning concerning the history or the period of time just prior to Messiah's coming, the centuries just prior. And I think it's relevant to the church at large because it sets the cultural context from which Messiah would have operated, the context into which he was, the cultural context into which he and Paul were born, that influences this whole discussion with respect to the conversation concerning Torah and its applicability to the church, believers today, juxtaposed against what the church has been teaching for a very long time. It also helps us to determine and learn really maybe the correct response and approach to the history of and the place of the Jewish information that they bring to the table, and our response to it, our reaction to it, how serious we take it, how how much we embrace it. And then also I think it discusses or it sheds light on what we do with the parabiblical writings. We're talking about the writings that are commonly referred to as the Apocrypha, things that are hidden or outside of the writings that others have hidden from us. But as we're finding in these Dead Sea Scroll writings from Qumran, and the probability that these were the scriptures from which Messiah and Paul and those guys were operating from, it tends to validate these parabiblical writings such as First Enoch and Jubilees and the Testament of the 12 Patriarchs, etc. So with that in mind, let me get started. So I want to go back to my timeline of the kings and prophets that we have covered in other videos here. And for those who are not able to see, we're looking at this period of time on the timeline where in around 536 BC, they begin to build the temple as the Yehudim begin leaving Babylon, as they begin to return from the lands of Babylon. Now, at this point in time, it's no longer the Babylonians who are controlling Babylon or the Holy Land. It is Persia through Cyrus and then Darius and then later Xerxes, which is when Esther becomes queen and the book of Esther plays out. And then you've got Artaxerxes, which is when Ezra plays out. So on this timeline, we've got the captivity of the Jews in Babylon for 70 years in blue, and then we have this purple where they begin their return to the land under the governorship of Zerubbabel. So when they come out of Babylon, Zerubbabel is the governor of the land under Persia, but he's the governor and the guider, the leader of the Yehudim during this period of time. And he's the leader as the temple is being finished. So they begin to build the temple in 536. They stop building it, and then they resume the temple building again in 520, and then they complete it in 516. Now, during this period of time, it appears that the Yehudim were fairly faithful to the Torah and to Zerubbabel and to Yahweh during that period of time. But then we have some silence after we get some information through Haggai the prophet and Zechariah the prophet, who were the prophets during Zerubbabel's time here. But after they finish up, we get some silence here until the time of Ezra. Apparently, from their time forward, the priests, the Zadokite priests who were in charge, ended up all of the priests of Levi, the Zadokite priests, they ended up running off and intermarrying and just falling away from Torah. And by the time Ezra comes on the scene, the walls have been torn down. If you can see this timeline, in 466 BC, the walls of Jerusalem had been destroyed again. And in 457, that's when Ezra, I think he got his permission from Artaxerxes, comes back and finds disarray because the priests have intermarried and they just were not following Torah again. So he tears his clothes, and through the book of Ezra, you'll see that they end up coming back. And by the end of Ezra, the writings of Ezra, they seem to be back on track somewhat. But then they have we have this gap again where they're referring to here in 445 BC that there's a third return under Nehemiah. Now, I'm not sure. He must have brought some additional folks back from Babylon, because not everybody returned from Babylon back here when Zerubbabel and various people left and came back to the Holy Land. Some had stayed there, as evidenced by Nehemiah being there and Ezra being there for a period of time. Well, here in 445 BC, there's again this third return under Nehemiah. Well, I'm pretty sure that when Nehemiah got there, he found disarray again. I'd have to go read the book, but he found disarray. But his time runs from 433, where I believe he was the governor and just kind of overseeing the land at that point in time. And his writings and his governorship, the information we have, runs from 433 to 420 BC. And then from there, and let me also just say that his entire period of time appears to happen under Artaxerxes. If there is, and also his period of time is the period of time that Malachi, the last Nebium or prophet, was prophesying. And then we have Darius the second that comes on the scene for Persia. But then we go into some silence again. We go into a period of time where we just don't have, at least not in our scriptures, any additional information. And so it really kind of ends for us at 420 BC. And then I'm going to be coming back and picking this up in 332 BC, which is when Greece invaded the land and conquered Persia. And that's when we start picking up some additional history here. But let me also offer that throughout this entire period of time from 536 BC through 420, while there was failure in the land, the faithful, the remnant, the priests who care were all, they were crying for Torah. They were honoring Torah. So Torah was clearly the law of the land and the expectation of the remnant or the righteous during this time. I mean, it's the expectation for everybody, but only the righteous were really overly concerned about it, which is pretty similar to the circumstances we have had throughout time. Only the remnant really cares about Torah. The unfaithful don't, even though they know they're supposed to keep Torah, they don't really care about it or discuss it. So, okay, so for this next section, I'm going to virtually be reading from a book called The Complete Dead Sea Scrolls in English, and I highly recommend it for anybody who is interested in the Dead Sea Scrolls. There are others too, but this one has excellent write-ups. I don't know that, I think they're going to believe that it's the Essenes that were occupying the area of Bethabara or Qumran. Maybe, and I guess you have to factor all of that in, because that's going to be true of all of these Dead Sea Scroll booklets. But he has an excellent write-up. They have an excellent write-up related to what I think is germane here. I mean, they discuss the community and some other things, but I'm going to read from, and I am going to read, it's going to be about 3 or 4 pages long, so it'll be a little bit, might be a little hard to follow, but I'm going to put the pages up so you can read along, and then if you're just listening, I'll try to do a good job of reading for you. Okay, and so here we are at the section of the book titled Intertestamental Jewish History from 200 BCE to 70 CE. So from 200 years before Messiah to 70 years after Messiah. But actually they're starting back in 332 BC and giving us a little data there too. So let me just start reading. At the beginning of the 2nd century BCE, Palestinian Jewry passed through a state of crisis. Alexander the Great had conquered the Holy Land in 332 BC, and after the early uncertainties which followed his death, it became part of the empire of the Greeks of Egypt, known as the Ptolemies. During the 3rd century, the Ptolemies avoided, as much as possible, interfering with the internal life of the Jewish nation, and while taxes were required to be paid, it remained under the rule of the high priest and his council. Important changes in the patterns of population nevertheless took place during this time. Hellenistic cities were built along the Mediterranean coast, such as Gaza, Ascalon, Joppa, Dor, and Acco, renamed Ptolemais. Inland also to the south of the Lake of Tiberias, the ancient town of Beth Shean was reborn as the Greek city of Scythopolis. Samaria, the capital of the Samaritans, was Hellenized as Sebast, and in Transjordan, Rabath Ammon was refounded as Philadelphia. In other words, the Greeks, Macedonians, and Hellenized Phoenicians took up permanent residence on Palestinian soil, and the further spread of Greek civilization and culture was merely a matter of time. With the conquest of the Holy Land by the Seleucids or Syrian Greeks in 200 BC, the first signs appeared of Jews succumbing to a foreign cultural influence. In the apocryphal book of Ecclesiasticus, dated to the beginning of the 2nd century BCE, its author, Jesus ben Sira, a sage from Jerusalem, rages against those ungodly men who have forsaken the law of the Most High God. But the real trouble started when Antiochus IV Epiphanes, who reigned from 175 to 164 BCE, officially promoted a Hellenizing program in Judea that was embraced with eagerness by the Jewish elite. The leader of the modernist faction was the brother of the high priest Onias III. Let me just say that Onias III was the last legitimate Zadokite priest to sit as high priest. Jason, his brother, who was a son of Zadok, but not, he was not appointed to the priesthood by illegitimate means. He was appointed to the priesthood by an outsider, which would have been Antiochus IV or Antiochus Epiphanes. So while Jason was a Zadokite, he was not legitimate Zadokite priest, and he was sitting in the high priesthood was illegitimate. Okay, so let me go back up here. So, known as Jesus among his compatriots, he adopted the Greek name of Jason and set about transforming Jerusalem into a Hellenistic city by building a gymnasium there and persuading the Jewish youth to participate in athletic games. As 2nd Maccabees describes the situation, so Hellenism reached a high point with the introduction of foreign customs through the boundless wickedness of the impious Jason, no true high priest. As a result, the priests no longer had any enthusiasm for their duties at the altar, but despised the temple and neglected the sacrifices. And in defiance of the law, they eagerly contributed to the expenses of the wrestling school whenever the opening gong called them. They placed no value on their hereditary dignities, but cared above everything for Hellenic honors. 2 Maccabees 4:13-15. Jason was succeeded by 2 other high priests with the same Greek sympathies, Menelaus and Alcimus. In 169 BCE, Antiochus IV visited Jerusalem and looted the temple. But when in 167 he actually prohibited the practice of Judaism under pain of death and rededicated the Jerusalem sanctuary to Olympian Zeus, the abomination of desolation, the opponents of the Hellenizers finally rose up in violent resistance. An armed revolt was instigated by the priest Mattathias and his sons, the Maccabee brothers, supported by all the traditionalist Jews, and in particular by the company of the pious, the Hasidians or Hasidim, stalwarts of Israel, every one of them a volunteer in the cause of the law. So the Hasidians were considered pious, and they were supporting the Maccabee rising or revolt. So led by Judas Maccabeus, and after his death on the battlefield by his brothers Jonathan and then Simon, the fierce defenders of Judaism were able not only to restore Jewish worship in Jerusalem, but against all expectations even managed to eject the ruling Seleucids and to liberate Judea. The Maccabean triumph was, however, not simply a straightforward victory of godliness and justice over idolatry and tyranny. It was accompanied by serious social and religious upheavals. There was firstly a change in the pontifical succession. When the murder in 171 BCE of Onias III and the deposition of the usurper, his brother Jason, the Zadokite family from which the incumbents of the high priest office traditionally came, lost the monopoly from which which it had held for centuries. And that's true. I'll just comment here that the Aaronic priesthood was ordained. It was not just a monopoly. It was ordained by Yahuwah, and it was held. It was held by the sons of Aaron through the days of David, but with the fall of one of the sons of Aaron, the Zadokite family took over the high priesthood, and from David forward, it was the sons of Zadok who held the high priesthood, and the Zadokite family, the sons of Zadok held that through Onias III. And while, again, I'll just say it again, that while Jason was of a son of Zadok, he was not a legitimate high priest, was not appointed through the ways that high priests were appointed. He was basically given the position by Antiochus Epiphanes. Okay. So furthermore, when Onias IV, the son of Onias III, was prevented from taking over the high priesthood from Menelaus, he immigrated to Egypt and, in direct breach of biblical law, which authorizes only a single sanctuary in Jerusalem, erected a Jewish temple in Leontopolis with the blessings of King Ptolemy Philometor from 182 to 146 BCE. His inauguration of his Israelite worship outside Zion with the connivance of some priests and Levites must have scandalized every Palestinian conservative, especially other priests who belonged or were allied to the Zadokite dynasty. There was trouble also within the ranks of the Maccabees themselves. The Hasidim, or part of their group, defected when Alcimus, whom they trusted, was appointed high priest in 162 BCE. This move on their part turned out to be naive. Alcimus's Syrian allies massacred 60 of them in one day, according to 1 Maccabees 7, 2-20. Lastly, a major political change came about when Jonathan Maccabeus, himself a priest but not a Zadokite, accepted in 153 to 152 BCE pontifical office from Alexander Balas, a usurper of the Seleucid throne. Alexander was anxious for Jewish support and was not mistaken in thinking that an offer of the high priesthood would be irresistible. For the conservatives, this was an illegal seizure of power. But they were even more scandalized by the appointment in 140 BCE following Jonathan's execution in 143 to 142 by the Syrian general Tryphon of Simon Maccabee as high priest and hereditary leader of the people by means of a decree passed by a Jewish National Assembly. So basically, a Jewish National Assembly, who was not conservative, actually ended up appointing Simon Maccabee in place of Jonathan. So this time we had not an appointment of the high priest from an outsider. We have an appointment of the high priest, illegitimate high priest, not by an outsider this time, but by the Jewish National Assembly. So the Jewish National Assembly themselves appointed an illegitimate priest, which is the point here. They would be scandalized. The conservative, the sons of Zadok would be scandalized by all that. Okay, so to continue. From then on until Pompey's transformation of the independent Jewish state into a Roman province in 63 BCE, Judea was ruled by a new dynasty of high priests, later priest kings, known as the Hasmoneans after the grandfather of the Maccabees, Hasmon, or Asamoneus according to Josephus. During the intervening years, all Simon's successors, but especially John Hyrcanus I in 134 to 104 BCE, and Alexander Jannaeus, 103 to 76 BCE, for whom their political role took precedence over their office of high priest, occupied by one of the Hellenistic cities of Palestine and conquered the neighboring territories of Idumea in the south and Samaria in the center and Iturea in the north. And I'll just comment, those all became provinces in the land, in the Holy Land, what became known as provinces, and then areas that were governed by these various Hellenistic Hasmonean priest kings that got appointed under Rome after the Greeks were defeated. Okay, so to continue. Throughout this period of territorial expansion, the Hasmonean rulers enjoyed the support of the Sadducees, one of the three religious parties first mentioned under Jonathan Maccabees, and regular allies of the government. They were opposed by the Pharisees, an essentially lay group formed from one of the branches of the Hasidim of the Maccabean age. Already in the days of John Hyrcanus I, there was Pharisaic objection to the usurpation of the high priesthood, though they were willing to recognize him as national leader, but on one other occasion at least, their opposition was overcome by force. Accused of plotting against Alexander Jannaeus in 88 BCE, in collusion with the Syrian Seleucid king Demetrius III, Eucharius, 800 Pharisees were condemned by Jannaeus to die on the cross. After Pompey's seizure of Jerusalem, the Hasmonean high priesthood continued for another 3 decades. But the political power formerly belonging to them passed to the Judaized Idumean Herod the Great, when he was promoted to the throne of Jerusalem by Rome in 37 BCE. It is to the last year or two of his reign, he died in 4 BCE, that the Gospels of Matthew and Luke date the birth of Jesus of Nazareth. After the ephemeral rule of the successor to Herod the Great, Herod Archelaus, in 4 BCE to 6 CE, who was deposed by Augustus for his misgovernment of Jews and Samaritans alike, Galilee continued in semi-autonomy under their Herodian princes Antipas in 4 BCE to 39 CE and Agrippa 39 to 41 CE, but Judea was placed under the direct administration of Roman authority. In 6 CE, Coponius, the first Roman prefect of Judea, arrived to take up his duties there. This prefectorial regime, whose most notorious representative was Pontius Pilate, lasted for 35 years until 41, when the Emperor Claudius appointed Agrippa I as king. He died, however, 3 years later, and in 44 CE, the government of the province once more reverted to Roman officials, this time with the title of procurator. Their corrupt and unwise handling of Jewish affairs was one of the chief causes of the War of 66, which led to the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 CE, and to the subsequent decline of the Sadducees, the extinction of the Zealots in Masada in 74, the disappearance of the Essenes, and the survival and uncontested domination of the Pharisees and the rabbinic successors. It is into this general course of events that the history of Qumran has to be inserted. Document by document, the scrolls will be scrutinized and the literary information combined both with the findings of Qumran archaeology and with the incidental reports provided by Josephus. In the end, it is hoped that the history of the Essene sect will begin to fall reliably into place. So let me just comment here before I move on. So, while they are saying that that when we had the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 CE, we also had the subsequent decline of the Sadducees, so they fell off the scene. The extinction of the Zealots in Masada in 74. I'm not sure who they mean by the Zealots in Masada. That could be a number of different things. They could mean the Zadokites. I'm not sure. And the disappearance of the Essenes. Now, I personally think that's what he's referring to as the Zadokites, because he's calling the Zadokites Essenes. And there's this big assumption that the folks who lived in the Qumran area or Bethabar were Essenes and not the descendants and not the priests of Zadok, which is what I believe they are now. And then the survival and uncontested domination of the Pharisees and the rabbinic successors. So with the fall of Jerusalem, basically everybody went away but the Pharisees. And the Pharisees are the ones that ended up controlling really Judaism. And they also controlled the scriptures. They were the ones that determined what would be included in the canonization of the old writings, what would be included and what would be left outside. So let's organize that period of time. Let me first go back to the period of time right after the death of Alexander, and how the Empire of Greece was split up. So in roughly 301 BC, after Alexander's death, here is how the empire looked. To the north here in the purple is Macedonia and Greece. Then you've got Thrace, which would be the empire of Lysimachus. I'm not quite sure. We don't really follow these two because they're just not germane to our discussion of the Holy Land down here, or the Promised Land. But here in the orange is the empire of the Seleucids. And then to the south here is the empire of the Ptolemies. And you can see that it was the Ptolemies who had jurisdiction over the Holy Lands and the lands of Judea and Israel, etc., and Jerusalem. So in 301, it is the Ptolemies who are controlling this land. And according to the write-up that we just saw, they pretty much left the Judeans alone, let them manage their own affairs, but they began building Hellenistic cities throughout during the days of the Ptolemies. Okay, let me go to the next one, which would be, here's what the empire looked like in 275 BC, which is pretty similar. Here are the Seleucids up here in the green, and then you've got the independent states, and I'm not quite sure how. We're not going to focus on the Antigonid Empire or the independent states to the north. We're only interested in, for our purposes, the Seleucid Empire here in green, and the Ptolemies still controlling but expanding somewhat their control of this area throughout the lands of Judea, etc. Okay, and then we move to the Ptolemaic Empire in 200 BC, just before everything changed. So really, nothing really changes, except for here we see just before the change that the Ptolemaic Empire had expanded all the way up to here. We had the Seleucid Empire still up in this area, considered the Syrian Empire. And that's how it looked just before the Seleucids took the land. Let's go there. Let's go there now. And here's 7 BC, or I think this must be 188 BC, but roughly this is how it looked around the time that Antiochus had taken over, and that the Seleucid Empire had taken over these lands here in the Middle East, or what would be the lands of Judea and Israel, etc. So the regime in this area had changed. And when we go to the timeline here in a moment, the chronological timeline, we're going to see that Antiochus had expanded their empire, their control down to the borders of Egypt here. And we're going to see that Antiochus continued to try to make a campaign against Egypt, but ultimately never really succeeded in that. And then Rome comes from up here to the north and west and begins to support the Egyptian areas, and then ultimately really starts working their way into the lands of the Seleucid Empire as well. And so this is what the map looked like as we begin our chronology here and our time with Antiochus and the Maccabees. So let's pull together the chronological timeline of what we've been discussing here. In 332, Alexander invades and conquers the empire of Persia and takes over the lands that Persia had controlled. That included Israel, but also went south into Egypt as well. But then pretty quickly, Alexander dies, and his kingdom, his empire, is divided into 4. We have two We have part of his kingdom or empire, was up around Greece and Macedonia. Another one was up north in those regions, but we don't hear too much about it. To the far south were the Ptolemies, who controlled the Egyptian lands and then extended that up into Israel. And then you had, to the north of them, you had the Seleucids, who controlled the lands north of Israel, including Babylon, the lands of Babylon, the lands of Persia, the lands of Assyria, etc. So it stayed that way until 197 BCE, and that's when we have the chronology offered to us in the Complete Dead Sea Scrolls in English book here, which we'll use as a timeline and as framework to go forward here. So in BCE 197, Judea becomes a province of the Seleucid Empire, ruled by the Syrian successors of Alexander the Great. And I'm not sure who was ruling from 197 to 187. This is also the time of the books of the Maccabees, by the way, and you can fill in a lot of this data by reading the Maccabees. But in 187, and for 12 years, Seleucus IV comes to power and begins the Hellenistic infiltration, which was resisted by the Zadokite high priest Onias III. So during the time of Seleucus, we still had Onias III, who was a Zadokite high priest and the last of, sitting in that role and in that place. So in 175, however, Antiochus IV, Antiochus Epiphanes, comes to power, and I think he rules longer than 164, but I'm not sure. But certainly they've given us a timeline here of 175 to 164. And Antiochus IV deposes and replaces him with his Hellenophile brother Jason, which means he's a Hellenizing, he's just a defender of the Hellenistic programs. In fact, he was a champion of the Hellenistic programs. So in 175, the Zadokite priesthood comes to an end and is replaced by illegitimacy. So to whatever extent the priesthood was successful in retaining and sharing and playing out their role of leading the people into the ways of Yahuwah, it came to an end in 175. In 175 and forward in time, we had an illegitimate high priesthood. The Zadokites never returned during those times or today. They have never returned to the position of high priest. That's not to say that Levites didn't continue to serve. They did, and priests continued to serve in their roles as they were established in the days of David, when they just established the various. You'd have to see it. But basically, they continued to serve, but they lost solid leadership. So from 175 forward, any leadership, any rulings, any ways that are handed down from the high priesthood that would be opposed or juxtaposed against Torah and the ways of the legitimate priesthood should be given their proper authority. Basically, it has none. It's just, and this is, we'll just stop there and we'll continue. So, but Jason, who replaced, and by the way, I'll just say he bought it from Antiochus, and then he only lasted for 3 years. So from 175 to 172, and then he was expelled from office in favor of Menelaus. Well, Menelaus also bought it from Antiochus, just paid more money than Jason apparently. But Menelaus was every bit as much in the camp of Hellenizing and was a Hellenizing priest as Jason was. And he lasted in that role or in that place from 172 to 162, so about a decade, 10 years. And then in 171, Onias III, the last of the Zadokite priests, was murdered at the instigation of Menelaus. And then we saw the forcing of Hellenization. I will also say that the son, around this time, is when the son of Onias III, Onias IV, left, because the Zadokites and the family of Zadok and those, they left and went to Egypt, seeing that they could not continue in the land here and set up another another place down there for the Zadokites, but that's considered illegitimate as well. So what the natural line of Onias did was leave the land and go down to Egypt, which was not acceptable either. So in 169, Antiochus, led by Menelaus, profaned and plundered the temple of Jerusalem. In 168, Antiochus was thwarted by the Romans in his second campaign against Egypt. If you go back to this Seleucid map that I'd provided, you could see the line down there where the Seleucids had taken over Israel and the lands of the Middle East, but they were stopped there at Egypt, but they kept continuing to try to take that land. There was ongoing wars and battles between the Ptolemies and the Seleucids, and the Romans began to enter the scene pretty strongly here as well, because it's the Romans who apparently had thwarted and resisted and allowed the Ptolemies to resist Antiochus' attempts to enter and take Egypt. So in 167, as Antiochus has returned from the lands of Egypt, the persecution of the Jews opposed to the unification of the Seleucid Empire on the basis of Greek culture and religion begins in earnest, and the official abolition of Jewish religion practice begins under threat of death, and the temple was transformed into a sanctuary of the Olympian god Zeus, the abomination of desolation by many accounts, and I'm sure it's true. Apparently there's another abomination of desolation to occur at some point in the future here, but this was certainly an abomination of desolation. Then in 166, as a result of those pressures and the work and everything that Antiochus is doing, the Maccabees rise. It says, the Maccabees rise, supported by all the traditional parties, including the Hasidim, under the leadership of Judas Maccabee. Well, yes, but it also started under his father, Mattathias. So, but Judas is the first to rise to power and then really begin the campaigns against the Greeks, and successful campaigns. I mean, if you read the Maccabees, you'll see. I mean, you would want to read the Maccabees for more information about the success of these efforts. But after a couple years of these battles, we ended up with a truce and a cleansing of the temple, even though it was still held by Menelaus. So the Maccabees were having success, but the Zadokite priesthood was gone, and just not. I don't know that they were completely gone. Some had left, but clearly the high priesthood was being controlled by Menelaus, and that was apparently acceptable. It certainly wasn't replaced. The Maccabees didn't do anything to replace the illegitimate priesthood that had taken over. So in 162, then, Menelaus is executed by the Syrians, and Alcimus is appointed as high priest by the king. My understanding is that Alcimus was a favored high priest by the Maccabeans, according to the writings we just read. And then we have Demetrius the first, who is ruling from 162 to 150. Antiochus has ruled from 175 to 162 BCE, at which time Demetrius takes over. And Menelaus is in the last couple of years of his, I guess at 162, that's when Menelaus is executed by the Syrians. And Alcimus is appointed high priest by the king, who was considered friendly to and with the Maccabees, according to what we just got through reading. So then in 161, Judas is killed in battle, and Jonathan assumes leadership of the rebels, and apparently led that rebellion from 162 to 150. 161 to 152, but I'm not sure that's correct because of what we're going to find down here in a moment here. So just a few years later, Alcimus didn't last very long, and he's appointed. He dies of a stroke. At which time, and that's in 160. At which time there's an end to the Syrian military intervention. So I'm not really sure what took place from 160 forward. I'd have to go looking in the Maccabees to see who might have been serving at that time between the death of Alcimus in 160 and 152. But in 152, Alexander Balis, if that's how you pronounce his name, ends up taking over from Demetrius I, apparently. Well, this is during the time of Demetrius, so I'm not really quite sure. I know it's very confusing. There's a lot of interaction going on in and around the lands at that time. But apparently, under Demetrius, Alexander Balis usurps the Seleucid throne and appoints Jonathan as high priest. So I know that there were, according to the readings, as he was trying to come to power, he was trying to garner the favor of Jonathan, and then who was leading. He was leading Israel at the time, or the Yehudim at the time. He had assumed leadership from his brother Judas, and so Alexander sought to garner his favor, and then more or less bring the Yehudim under his to his side, which he did, and Jonathan accepted. So then we have, following up these Hellenizing high priests, we now have the first of the Maccabeans serving as high priest, that also become known as the Hasmoneans, and then the Hasmonean kings, and then they become priests and kings. But anyways, in 152, Alexander Baeus appoints Jonathan as high priest, Jonathan Maccabeus. In 145, Antiochus V, son of Alexander, is raised to the throne by Tryphon, his father's general, and Jonathan is named governor of Syria. Simon, his brother, is made military governor of the Palestinian littoral. But then Jonathan is arrested by Tryphon in 143, at which time Simon is appointed high priest. And if you remember the writing, Jonathan is appointed by Alexander, Jason is appointed by Antiochus IV, as was Menelaus. Alcimus was appointed by Demetrius, but Simon becomes the very first high priest, illegitimate high priest, and he was given the role. He was appointed to that role by a Judean council, a Judean assembly, which was the first time now we had the Jews, the Yehudim, electing their high priest. That was not of the Zadokite priesthood. So it's just, they've gone pretty far from where they originated. And then in 142, Jonathan is executed in prison, and Simon's title is confirmed. Simon becomes high priest. Well, I'm sorry. Simon's title as high priest is confirmed as hereditary, meaning that it's going to pass through his lines now. And the foundation of the Maccabean or Hasmonean dynasty begins. In 135, Simon is murdered by his son-in-law. And then we have John Hyrcanus, the first, becoming high priest in Ethnarch, whatever Ethnarch is. And this is when we're introducing the opposition of the Pharisees to what John Hyrcanus is doing as high priest, maybe because they're not Zadokites, I'm not sure. But this is the first time we see the Pharisees coming and being mentioned. And it appears that the Pharisees and the Sadducees both arose during this period of time as the Zadokite priesthood has been deposed and other priests, illegitimate priests, have come to power. Then we have the rising to power of the Sadducees, and the Sadducees were holding the high priesthood at the time of Messiah. So, the Sadducees were probably, I think Rachel was suggesting that, or maybe we heard something and she didn't mean it that way, but the idea that the Sadducees were just simply the priests, I don't think that is true. It doesn't go back to the days of the Zadokites. I don't think the Sadducees would go back that far. I think the Sadducees would be the high priest, but under all of the legitimacy that we see, and that would also be, I'm sure, would be. The fact that they didn't believe half the things that is so germane to what the Zadokites believe. They didn't believe in the resurrection. They don't believe in spirits. They don't believe. There's just so much they didn't believe in, which would not be true under the legitimate priesthood. So the Sadducees probably arose after the deposition of the last Zadokite and under the illegitimate priesthood of the Hellenists and then the Maccabeans and the Hasmoneans. And apparently the Pharisees rose during that time too, which was just a party. It was a grouping of people and under leadership, and they were growing in influence and power. So apparently they opposed John Hyrcanus, which then I think there were 60 of them killed when that happened. I believe it was under him. Maybe, maybe I might be getting that wrong. But so in 104, Aristobulus the first becomes high priest and king. Okay, so Aristobulus the first is the first of the Hasmonean or Maccabean high priest that also becomes king of the land. And then he was, and then Alexander Jannaeus became high priest and king and conqueror, who was resisted by the Pharisees. So we have the opposition of the Pharisees up here, but now we have the resistance of the Pharisees. I believe it was at this time that 800 of them were killed as they resisted Alexander Jannaeus. And then in 76, we had Alexandra, wife of Jannaeus, queen, friend of the Pharisees, and Hyrcanus II serving as high priest. I'm not sure why they're giving us Alexandra. Not sure how germane that is or where that would be. I suppose a lot of this is still, well, no, we're not really in the Maccabees. We're not going to get this history from the Maccabees as well. So I'm not sure where they're pulling this, probably from some of the writings they took from the Dead Sea Scrolls and some of the other extra writings or parabiblical writings. But anyways, now we have Hyrcanus II serving in 67 BCE, serving as king and priest, and he's deposed by his brother Aristobulus. And then we have Aristobulus taking the role of king and high priest in 67 to 63 BC. And it's at that time that Pompey and Rome enters onto the scene and basically takes control of the land. So from 63 forward, Jerusalem and Judea becomes a Roman province, and now we have the influence of the Romans in the land, not the Greeks or the Seleucids or even the Maccabeans anymore. So from 63 to 40, we have Hyrcanus II reinstated as high priest without a royal title. I'm not sure exactly what that means. Then we have from 40 to 37, we have Antigonus, son of Aristobulus II, occupying the throne and pontificate with Parthian support. Not sure exactly what that means. I know that he becomes king and high priest again, but I'm not sure who the Parthians were. I'd have to go looking for that. Then Hyrcanus is maimed and exiled. And then in 37, we have Herod the Great and the end of the Hasmonean dynasty and the beginning of the Herodian dynasty. So Herod the Great comes on the scene, and he dies in 4 BCE. And then in 27, from 27 to 14, we have Augustus serving as emperor of Rome. And then in 6 BCE, they're suggesting that is the birth of Jesus of Nazareth. And they're saying this because Herod the Great dies in 4 BCE, and Herod's the one that ordered the death and the killing of all the children in and around the land of Bethlehem. And so a couple years before his death, they're assuming then would be 6 BCE. And then from 4 BCE to 6 CE, we have Archelaus as the ethnarch of Judea and Samaria. And then from 14 CE, so this is after the Common Era begins, to 37 CE, Tiberius is the emperor. And then from 26 to 36, we have Pontius Pilate serving as the prefect of Judea. Then they're showing 30 CE as, with a question mark, the crucifixion of Jesus. But as I made notes here, at 33, do a little math. If he died at 33 years old and you subtract 6 BCE, that would make this timing really to be 27 CE as the time of Messiah's death. And then they didn't put it in here, but we found it in the writings that we read a little bit earlier. And I find it interesting and thought I would mention it, that Pontius Pilate served from 26 CE to 36 CE, and this was and the prefectorial regime that was instigated by, I can't think of his name, but that lasted from 6 CE to 41 CE, at which time the prefectorial regime was replaced in 41 by Emperor Claudius, and in 41 CE they appointed Agrippa as king. And so when we get to the time of Paul, when he's speaking to King Agrippa, that would be around, well, and let me just also say Agrippa died in 44. So the time of Paul going to see King Agrippa would have been between 41 CE and 44 CE, which would have been 12, 13, 14, 15 years after the death of Messiah. Then in 66 to 70 CE, we have the First Jewish War, ending with the capture of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple by Titus. And then in 73 to 74, we have the fall of Masada. And then we have in 132 to 135 a second unsuccessful Jewish war. Well, at this point in time, we have, again, the dispersion of the Jews to the south, primarily into the Egyptian areas once again. I think that I'm not sure what the fall of Masada was, but I believe this is about the time that also the Qumran area, Bethabara, also falls. And so if the Zadokites were there, which I believe they were, there's a compound of Zadokite priests and supporters was there, and then this is when they were dispersed as well. Okay, so let's see if we can do a quick summary. So we have history from the Bible from 586, when the Yehudim left Babylon, through 420 BC. During that time, we have the temple rebuilt. We have Ezra, then Nehemiah, and all of this is occurring inside of the Persian Empire. But in the land of Judea, we have governorships. We have Zerubbabel, and then we have Nehemiah serving as governors, and maybe Ezra to a lesser degree. I'd have to look at that. But then we lose history in 420 BC from the scriptures, but we start getting history from other places, and much of ours comes from the book of the Maccabees. So in 332, the Greeks conquer Persia, and Hellenization of Judea begins. And initially, after the death of Alexander, it's the Ptolemies. When they split into four, it's the Ptolemies from the Egypt area who are ruling the land of Israel, and kind of leave them alone, but they are setting up Hellenized cities and transforming cities into Hellenistic cities, etc. It's in 197 that's the Seleucids take that territory from the Ptolemies, excuse me, and so the Seleucids become the rulers of the Judean territory. A couple decades after that is when Antiochus IV comes on the scene and wreaks havoc for the Yehudim. I mean, already Hellenism is already happening, so I'm sure that's havoc all by itself. But then Antiochus comes on the scene, and the first thing he does is he deposes Onias III. So he ends the Zadokite priesthood. There is no more Zadokite priesthood. The legitimate high priesthood is over, and he replaces it with an illegitimate priesthood of Hellenistic priests, starting with Jason, the brother of Onias, and then Menelaus, and then Alcimus. He didn't place Alcimus. He was gone by the time Alcimus replaces Menelaus, but those are the Hellenistic priests that we had. Then we had, then after deposing Onias in 175, in 169, he plunders the temple with the assistance of Menelaus. In 167, having come back in defeat from trying to take the rest of Egypt, having come back, he abolishes Yehudim, the religion of the Yehudim, and he persecutes any who will, initiates a program of Hellenization, and then upon pain of death, anybody who practices the Yehudim religion would be killed. And also in 167 BC, the temple is desecrated and transformed to a temple of Zeus. So it's a year later then that the Maccabees rise up to resist and revolt against these efforts and these programs. And Mattathias is the initial Maccabean, but he turns it over pretty quickly to Judas, and for 15 years Judas leads that revolt. And a couple years into it, we have apparently enough success. The Maccabeans are successful enough in conquering and retaining control in the land that ultimately a truce occurs in 164 BC. And then in 152, Jonathan becomes the first of the Maccabeans appointed to the high priesthood. And then after his death in 143 BC, actually after his deposition and then his death, but in 143 BC, Simon becomes the second Maccabean appointed to the high priesthood. Let me just say again, illegitimate priests. While I think Jonathan or Simon, one of them was a priest, they were not Zadokite priests. So they might have been from the lineage of Levi, I'm not sure. But they're not the legitimate priesthood. They're not sons of Aaron, sons of Zadok. But then in 140 BC, Simon's title and position is confirmed as hereditary, and then the Hasmonean or Maccabean dynasty is established or founded. And during that time, from somewhere between 175, when Onias is deposed, and 135, we have the rising of the Sadducees and apparently the Pharisees. The Sadducees become associated with the high priesthood. I doubt that, maybe as early as Jason and Menelaus and Alcimus, but maybe after Alcimus too, were the Sadducees coming on the scene, and the Sadducees maybe being associated with the Maccabeans and the Hasmoneans. And then the Pharisees also apparently arose during that same 30 years and was more of a group, a party of sorts. But these are the first times they're being mentioned. And the Sadducees, all of the high priests at the time of Messiah, so that would be, the high priest Herod wasn't the high priest. So whoever the high priest was at the time that Messiah was born was considered a Sadducee. So they were Sadducees serving in the high priesthood at the time of Messiah's birth as well. Okay. So in 63 BC, Judea becomes a province of Rome. Rome conquers the land and conquers the Greeks and becomes the ruling empire of the land. And they begin establishing their own ways, but they did retain the priest kings, at least initially, of the Hasmonean and Maccabees. In 37 BC is when Herod the Great is appointed king, which ends then the Hasmonean or Maccabean dynasty and initiates the Herodian dynasty. So Herod is appointed as king in 37 BC, and he has served he serves for basically 33 years as king. He dies in 4 BC, so then it is, we're then estimating the birth of Messiah around 6 BCE. It could be 5 BC, but it has to precede 4 BC because we know that's when Herod the Great dies, and Herod's the one that had ordered the deaths, at the time of the three kings and the time that he orders the death of all the children in the land of Judea, or around Bethlehem anyway. So then just estimating that in 6 BC, the Messiah is born. In 4 BC, Herod the Great dies. And then in 27 AD, they show 30 AD, but it would probably be closer to 27, 28 AD is when Messiah is crucified. And then in 70 AD, Jerusalem is destroyed. So as a result of this history, what are some conclusions we can draw from all of this? First of all, let me address the cultural context of Messiah. Nowhere in any of this history did we see anything but Torah being the law of the land. Failure throughout the land and throughout history because people don't want to keep Torah, but Torah never ceased to be the accepted ways of Yahuwah and his expectations for his covenant people, his his chosen, his elect, the remnant. It was always his way. Never did we see in any of this history approaching Messiah, never did we see Torah being undermined as the appropriate ways of Yahuwah. Failure, yes, but change of Torah, no. It was the law of the land. It's what we saw that Messiah was born into. He was born into, Joseph was a righteous man. Zechariah and Elizabeth were righteous and obedient to all of the ways. Mary and Joseph fulfilled all of the requirements of Torah. So in the midst of, there weren't many, but in the time of Messiah, the faithful remnant were still observing Torah, and nowhere. So if we're going to have a change of the instructions, a change of the Torah, moving away from here is the Torah, here's what I expect you to do. If we're going to move away from that written code to a new code, which we will do, and there's writings that are clear that we will be doing that. But if we're going to do that, we need something very, very firm, more so than what we've received certainly out of Messiah, because Messiah affirms the Torah, and Paul's writings would not be strong enough to undo, and Paul's writings don't anyway. So enough of that, because I'm going to do another video to summarize this as well. But I would just say that the culture of Messiah was, as he walked into the land, or as he was born into the land, he was born into a Torah observant land, but also a land of disruption, because in the temple no longer was legitimate priesthood. Yes, there were temple activities and much going on there, but it was desecrated. It was just not. And that is not where Messiah went to go get his anointing. He did not go to the high priest to say, here I am as Messiah. Nope. He went to the area beyond the Jordan, to Bethabara, where he met up with John the Immerser, who I think was a Zadokite priest. Okay. So the culture was that there was no legitimate priesthood, in high priesthood, in the temple at the time of Messiah, and that Torah remained the law of the land. Then when we go back and when we learn that the legitimate Zadokite priesthood had been deposed and removed, what do we do with anything else that we're treating as heredity? That is, when we go to the Jews, the Judaism, to see how they observe Hanukkah, to see how they observe anything. We get so much of that. Where's that leadership coming from? It's coming from others than the Zadokite priesthood. So we need to be very careful with anything that we are pursuing from what Judaism is teaching us with regard to appropriate Torah observance. To the extent that Judaism is observing appropriate Torah, yes, good. But to the extent that they are outside of Torah, no, it's just, and if the calendars they're observing, it's not the same calendars that the Zadokites were observing. It's not the same calendars that they were commanded to observe, in the days of Jubilees, etc. So there's just a lot. We need to be very careful with what we're doing with this idea of how the Jews of today would want to celebrate many of the things that we believe are part of Scripture and just are not. So we need to be careful. And then what do we do with the parabiblical writings? Well, if the Zadokite priesthood was removed and they didn't go away, I know some of them went down to Egypt, and that would be illegitimate, but there are legends, and it appears that the writings that they found in the caves would have been the library of the priest from the temple, that they would have taken over with them over to the Bethabara area or the Qumran area, and this would have been these would have been the scriptures of the day. These would have been the scriptures that they were operating from and that we see in those caves. Those would be the scriptures that Paul would have been studying, that Messiah would have been, referencing and studying as well. They just knew. It wasn't until after the destruction of the temple in 70 AD that the Pharisees, who had risen to power during the time of the Maccabees or the illegitimate priesthood, they came to power, and they began to tell us after 70 AD, they began to tell us what was acceptable scripture and what wasn't acceptable scripture based upon their own objectives and reasons. So they hid away from us so much of the scripture that we now call apocrypha, that they're telling us that if we're reading, we don't get assigned a place in their heaven. But it's the Pharisees who have hidden away these scriptures. And so we're just now finding them and the evidence for them. And so the history that we're seeing, where the Zadokites would have been the keepers of the land of Qumran, which would have also then verified or validated the scriptures that we're finding, things like Jubilees, things like First Enoch. And with the apparent validation of these scriptures, we're finding information. Our knowledge base, our pool of information has grown, which has caused us to have increasing knowledge. And with this pool of expanding information and increasing knowledge, we're learning. We have the backdrop from which to begin to test what we've been learning in the church and what they've been teaching us in the church. And out of this is an evolving understanding. So, okay, that's my purpose of this video. Thanks for spending time with me, and may you be Baruch.